what in your view is the greatest threat to free speech, if you'd have to be specific about it?
Cowardly government. A lot of this stuff comes as a result of deep resentment and unhappiness, I think, that can only be produced by having a really unpleasant childhood. Not everybody understands the value of what we have in the West. A lot of people take it for granted. A lot of people don't realize how the freedom to speak and the freedom to think for yourself is connected to the scientific research, the technological progress, the types of societies that we live in, the freedoms that we enjoy, the prosperity that they enjoy, that they all rely on the freedoms that are at the core of our societies. A lot of institutions are just full of cowardly older people who don't want to be disliked by their kids' generation.
Welcome to the Quick Thought on That podcast. I am Þórarinn Hjartarson, and today I'm joined with the one and only Konstantin Kisin. Konstantin, thank you so much for accepting my invite.
No, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure.
Absolutely. Now, Konstantin, how are you?
I'm great, man.
Yeah?
I'm loving life. I'm really, really happy, enjoying it. Things are
Lovely.
great.
All right. We're off to a good start. Now, if you
Am I
enjoy
supposed to say that? Is that a polite thing to say in Iceland? Like, there are cultures where if you say that, it's very rude. There
No,
are also
yeah.
cultures in which if you say that, it's normal. Like in America, you ask anyone how they're doing, they're like, awesome. And
Yeah.
then in Britain, if you say you're doing great, everyone looks at you like you're a weirdo. Am I a weirdo in Iceland now?
No, you're not. But when people ask here, you usually get honest response. When I was living in the States, it was quite interesting. How are you was just like a hello. But here, it's more of a like if someone is not feeling that well, they'll tell you. But in America, they'll never tell you. So it was a quite interesting
Yeah.
shift there. But yeah,
So I did the right Icelandic thing. I told you how I actually am.
absolutely. Yeah, you did.
Good.
All right. Now, for you listening, if you enjoy this podcast, I would immensely appreciate if you'd consider subscribing to this channel. Now, quick introduction of Konstantin. He is the co-host of the increasingly popular podcast Triggernometry, along with his friend Francis Foster, which I encourage listeners to check out if they haven't. You are a Russian-born British comedian, an author, and a political commentator. Is there anything that you would like to add to this introduction?
No, that works for me.
All right, beautiful. I'd like to start off with your book. Now, I have to admit that before I contacted you, I hadn't read your book. I had listened to many of your podcasts, but I read the book now in preparation for this interview, and I think it's hard to put into words. It captures the moment beautifully. I think it's all of these things that people are much thinking about, but really cannot and do not express. So, on top of everything else, why did you decide to write this book?
Because I felt that someone should. I felt that someone should write a book like that. And I was looking around and nobody was writing it. So I thought maybe I should. Because to be honest with you, I wasn't that keen to write a book. I had people approach me about writing a book for several years in a row. And I wasn't really that interested because I have a lot of other things going on. Writing a book is a long and quite time heavy process, and I don't have a lot of time. My wife and I had a baby 4 months ago. We've been traveling a lot. Work trigonometry takes up a ridiculous amount of my time, so I've been very busy. I didn't really want to necessarily write it, but people were going, "No, you should," and I was like, well, if there was a book that I was going to write, it would be a book that, from my perspective as someone who comes from a different society, someone who was born in the Soviet Union, someone who grew up in the late Soviet Union and early modern Russia, an outsider's perspective on the West, and to remind people a lot of the things that people are forgetting in the West, particularly young people. And I just thought it was important for somebody to articulate in what was hopefully a both interesting and funny way, some of the things that actually we are starting to take for granted in the West and that we shouldn't take for granted.
Absolutely. And yeah, for those, just to plug the title, it's called An Immigrant's Love Letter to the West. And before people, because the issues that we are going to discuss today are somewhat controversial, although I think they should not be, as you discuss in the book. But just to allow people to get a quick sort of picture of your background, who are you? Like, what you come from the Soviet Union? Your family went through hell, if I'm being quite honest, um, with regards to that period of time. So yeah, if you could just give our listeners a quick capture of your background.
So I was born in the Soviet Union in the early 80s, and I grew up there. Then the Soviet Union collapsed all around us. During that short period of time when I was a kid, um, one of the things that I was aware of is that my father, who was a very promising student at at Russia's, the Soviet Union's really most prestigious university, Moscow State University, he was kicked out around the time that I was born and wasn't able to finish his PhD studies because something my grandfather, his father, had said about the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. So, from my earliest memories, I was kind of aware that I lived in a society where people would be punished for not only for the things they said, but for the things that other family members of theirs said as well. And you talk about my family going through hell. That isn't really the part of it that was hell. That was just, normal, what we call it in the UK, par for the course. That was pretty standard. Um, and then growing up, I obviously heard uh, from my grandparents the stories of what their lives were like under the Soviet Union during Stalin's time and so on, living through the Nazi occupation and so on. So I had all of that kind of family history in my mind to some extent. And then the Soviet Union collapses and society changes completely. And my dad went from being this poor student to very quickly, it was a weird time in Russia, getting together with a few friends, starting a small business. That business became a bigger business. Then they bought another business. Then they bought another business. And before they knew it, they owned one of Russia's first banks
Mm.
and were making a lot of money. And it was a pretty crazy time. And a few years later, the guy that started this bank took all the money and ran away to America, leaving my parents and all his other friends with really basically nothing.
Yeah.
And lots of other things. Some of it's in the book, and people can go and read it. But basically, I went through growing up in a totalitarian society to being in this like crazy, completely free society, to from being very poor to being very rich, back to very poor in like 10 years during my formative years. So I've kind of seen different ways of looking at it. And when my parents did have the money, they sent me to boarding school in England, which is how I ended up living in Britain. And so I've kind of got all these different perspectives from all the different things that I've seen and my family has seen. And I that's what I realized. I see, when you're growing up, you kind of think, well, yeah, everybody knows what I know. Like my thoughts are, everybody understands the things I understand. And then in 2018, I was a comedian at this point, and I got offered this contract to do a comedy show at a university, and they said that they had a zero tolerance policy if you wanted to perform on racism, sexism, classism, ageism, ableism, homophobia, biphobia, transphobia, xenophobia, Islamophobia, anti-religion, and anti-atheism. And I was like, oh, this is a bit excessive, isn't it? And I turned it down and I said something about it on social media to like 800 followers at the time or whatever it was. And this thing like went super crazy, super viral. It was everywhere. And I was like, well, we all understand, don't we, that in a free society, comedians should be able to make different kinds of jokes. And if some people don't like them, that's the price we pay for living in a free society, because we know what happened in societies that were not free. Like if you look around the world and you go, which are the societies where comedians are restricted from joking? you go, I'm not sure I want to live in those societies. And I kind of thought like everybody got this, uh, except when I turned down that contract, suddenly it turned out I was the bad one in some people's eyes. I was the one that was wrong. And a lot of people didn't really understand where I was coming from or why I did what I did. And that's when I started to realize that actually not everybody understands the value of what we have in the West. A lot of people take it for granted. A lot of people don't realize how the freedom to speak and the freedom to think for yourself is connected to the scientific research, the technological progress, the types of societies that we live in, the freedoms that we enjoy, the prosperity that they enjoy, that they all rely on the freedoms that are at the core of our societies. A lot of people, it turns out, don't actually follow the connection. They think that if you restrict what people say and restrict what people are allowed to research and restrict what people are allowed to do, that will have no impact on the rest of the way that we do things. And of
Mhm.
course, that's very naive and very untrue. And that's when it was like a light bulb. Aha, some people don't understand, and then I realized that actually it was very stupid of me to expect them to understand these things, because they didn't live through what I lived through, and they didn't have the historical perspective that I have. And I'm not saying my perspective is more valid, I'm just saying it's a perspective they never were confronted by. So that's when I was like, well, maybe I should write a book that will actually, for those of them who are going to be willing to read it, illuminate some of these things from an outsider's perspective, so that they can see Britain, America, and other Western countries through my eyes. And maybe that will help some of them see it in a slightly healthier way.
That's an interesting point. Do you give any validation to the argument that people often make with regards to race relations in, for instance, the states, that lived experience is a variable that should be taken into a consideration when people are having expressing different opinions, especially with regards to, for instance, race relations? Maybe white people should not have specific opinions about these issues.
Mm. I think that the way that the term lived experience has been quite disingenuous. So I am not suggesting that my quote unquote lived experience outside of the West entitles me to tell other people not to speak.
Hmm.
I'm not suggesting that my lived experience outside the West means that I should be the one who decides what the laws of the country are. I'm not suggesting that lived experience entitles me to any sort of privilege over other people in terms of communicating about these ideas or anything else. All I wanted to do was to put my perspective on the table so that it would be one of the perspectives that we are looking at the West through. Right, there are
Hmm.
complicated conversations. So I know why you're asking me this question, because the term lived experience, and sometimes people say this to me, well, look, you wrote a book about your experiences, and therefore aren't you suggesting that people who claim their lived experience is valid? I never suggested that someone's personal experience is completely invalid in a conversation. It, however, is invalid if you're demanding society-wide changes based on your one personal experience, right? So if you're talking about race relations, I do think a black person coming forward and saying, I've had these and these experiences in my life, and I want that to be reflected in the way we talk about this. I think that's extremely valid. And I've always said this. I've always said, look, I have, during BLM, I was very critical of BLM and the way that it happened. But I also saw that there were people that I know, black guys, who would say, well, look, when I was a kid growing up in Britain, I don't think Britain's this evil country, but I did get arrested, not arrested, I did get stopped and searched by the police a lot because I was a young black kid. That would be their perception. And that definitely adds something to the mix of the different voices that we need to have around the discussion. I just don't think one experience or one person's perspective entitles them to dictate to others what they can and can't talk about, or to dictate to others what opinions they are and aren't allowed to hold. So my book isn't saying I've got this Soviet lived experience, therefore none of you are allowed to have an opinion. Right,
Hmm.
that's kind of the difference and the distinguishing line between, I think, the good counter argument you're putting to me and what I actually believe.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's quite interesting. I don't know if you remember this, but like within the woke realm of politics, maybe 6 or 7 years ago, probably, it was completely banned to make any generalizations. But now we ought to take like a specific lived experience and make generalization about that. So now all of a sudden, making generalizations about lived experience is okay, although it was forbidden just few years back.
Mm. And it applies to many other things. We're not allowed to make generalizations about uh, a sex, right?
Yeah.
Except the male sex. We're not allowed to make generalizations about races of people, except some races of people. We aren't allowed to make generalizations about some sexualities, except this one sexuality, and so on and so on and so on. So a lot of the tactics are very disingenuous, which is, I think, what you're getting at.
hmm Yes, absolutely. Now, I want to, because my listeners know that my favorite topic is free speech, and you talk a lot about free speech in this book, which I found very appealing. Now, quoting your book, yes, technically we have free speech, but successive generations still need to defend it. Why? Because it is constantly at risk of attack from people that think they know better. Now that captures the moment perfectly in my eyes. What, in your view, is the greatest threat to free speech if you'd have to be specific about it?
Cowardly government. Cowardly
Ah,
government, which is what we have at the moment. Because at the moment, the people who are demanding restrictions on speech, they are not in power. Certainly not in my country. In the US, they are and they aren't to some extent. It's hard to say, but certainly in the UK, and I don't know what the situation is like in Iceland, but over here, um, we have had a conservative government for 12 years, which is happily going along with many of the demands of these activists. And from what I understand, they're going along with it because they don't really understand exactly what's going on. They're trying also to deal with the very significant challenges posed by the creation of social media and this new online world, which has changed the way we communicate. We're kind of living through a technological revolution of the kind that human beings have almost never seen, other than maybe the invention of the printing press and a couple of other major inventions that totally transformed the way human beings communicated. So these people in power are bowing to the activists. They're bringing in a lot of these progressive ideologues into the heart of government to train them how to not be sexist or not say the wrong things and whatever, and in their desire to maybe compensate for genuine problems in the past where, if you go into the Houses of Parliament, I was invited to go for a tour by a friend recently. You look around and it is obviously a very white male environment in terms of the people who are there now, in terms of the people who are on the walls and on the portraits and whatever. And I think that there are a lot of people in those spaces who feel guilty about that, who've been told they should feel guilty about that, and their response, their knee-jerk reaction is, well, let's bring in someone who can help us be slightly less racist or to be slightly less or whatever it is. And they bring in these rather extreme activists who then implement these get them to implement these very counterproductive policies like the ones in the UK where we essentially have laws which criminalize what you can and can't say. If you say the wrong thing, you can be prosecuted, you can be investigated, you can be arrested by the police for posting a meme on your Facebook, for example. This is the extent to which it's gone. And this is the product not of just, the evil progressives, quote unquote, taking over government. It's because the cowardly government would rather pretend they don't know what a woman is than actually address these issues in the right way, which, by the way, is important. I do think addressing the lack of opportunity for certain groups of people in society is important, but I just think the way to do that is to get the barriers out of people's way. If we say that, 40 or 50 years ago, there was prejudice and discrimination against people from different groups in employment, I have absolutely no argument with that. I think it was unquestionable that that would have been happening. And the solution to that is to get those barriers out of people's way and say, look, we had these issues in the past. Now we're not going to privilege one group of people or another. We're just going to say, if you're good enough, you get in. And if you're not good enough, you don't get in. And I'm talking about meritocracy. And of course, true meritocracy is never possible. The people are always going to have their own individual emotions and prejudices, and they don't like tall people, they don't like short people, they don't like whatever. But to the best of our ability, we should try and strive for meritocracy, rather than thinking that the solution to previous racial discrimination is present racial discrimination, which is the explicit argument of people like Ibrahim Kendi, who write that that is the way to solve these problems. And I don't believe that you can solve racism by being racist.
Yeah, this is quite interesting. I mean, Ibram Kendi is now trying to dodge John McWhorter's offer to debate him, but which is an obvious implication that he is wrong about something. But sticking to the UK, because it's interesting that you say that this cowardly government, because the incentive structure should imply that the people are fed up with this woke nonsense. I mean, we saw that in the last election when the northern wall, the red wall in the north, just collapsed completely. We got Brexit, so people are obviously pretty fed up with the woke thing. Why do you think the politicians, and especially in the UK, do not see that the incentive structures really should imply or show them that this is not the way to go?
I think that most politicians exist in a very isolated space. They spend very little time talking to the sort of people that you're talking about. They don't go to the red wall unless they really, really have to. They don't talk to the people on the ground. I don't think they like most of those people. I don't think they think that they're good people, particularly. I think there's a lot of elitism and snobbery that happens, and they think that the people who are concerned about these issues are concerned about them because they're bad people, or that they can't be trusted. And we saw this happen under New Labour and under the Tories as well. You know, these are people who generally they live in the big metropolitan cities of their respective countries. They are surrounded by people who think like them. They read the newspapers that talk about all these issues in a particular way. They spend most of their time and get most of their ideas from Twitter, which is really not very representative of the country. And so they live in a bit of an echo chamber in which they are isolated from the consequences of their actions until they get a wake up call like a Brexit, like a Trump, neither of which I supported, by the way, but which were obvious consequences of their elitism and separation from the ordinary person. And that's, I think, how they end up in a position where, while I agree with you, a cold-hearted, rational, pragmatic look at the electoral map would suggest that they need to pursue certain policies. The reality is, for personal, emotional reasons, they would rather be seen to be doing the right thing by the Guardian newspaper than doing the right thing by the people of Britain. And I think that's kind of, Boris Johnson, at least that was his problem. That's the problem of many previous leaders as well. They care far too much about the sort of people they go to dinner parties with, say, than the sort of people who are actually voting for them, say. And I think that's the source of that disconnect that you identified.
Yeah, that's very interesting. Have you read Czesław Milosz, The Captive Mind?
No.
It's a fantastic book. He describes this pretty well, where in which he's talking. He's a Lithuanian Polish poet who was speaking about. He coined it "Catman," which is a phrase to describe basically the atmosphere of discourse within the Soviet Union during his time, where in which he
Mm.
says that people become actors that pretty much allow themselves to deceive themselves in order to deceive others. So they
Hmm.
talk in this broad terms of the party, and they always try to sort of tiptoe around the issues with in a proper manner. So I think that captures this what you're describing with regards to people who are trying to pander to not the voters but the people who are actually just in their surroundings. And I think that is quite dangerous, to be completely honest, because the incentive structure is based on people who are just surrounded by you, we don't have a real democracy. Then you're just allowing people to sort of, yes, you can vote, but for 4 years I will exclusively be trying to persuade that I'm a good person to people that are live in London.
Hmm. And notice how they refer to movements that arise out of the frustration with their stranglehold on power and their unwillingness to respond to the democratic wishes of the people. Any movement that comes along and says, actually, the mainstream's getting it wrong, both parties are screwing you over, neither of them is implementing the things that you wanted, what do they call them? They call them populists. Now, I don't agree with many of the policies that the populists suggest. And an overreaction is always likely in that situation, because if you build up anger as an individual or as a group of people, and you build it up and build it up and build it up, and then you release it, there will always be an element of that that's unfair, that's an overreaction, that goes too far, and it's probably not the way you wanted to have done things. But nonetheless, the anger and the source of it are very legitimate. And yet, the way that the mainstream deals with it is by going, oh, these are just these populists. And they're all racist, they're all evil, they're all Nazis, they're all bigots and whatever, which is, I think, deeply disrespectful to the concerns of a lot of people whose views are not actually prejudiced or bigoted or whatever. In the UK, for example, last month, in August, I suspect this is less of a problem for Iceland, given how isolated you guys are from everybody else. But for us, the fact that we've got a lot of illegal immigration going on is a big problem, because we have people coming over in boats from France, a war-torn country, as you know, and the difficulty there is that nobody voted to have 8,000 people come into this country by boats. Nobody voted for that, and almost everybody in this country voted against that being the case. We wanted to have a controlled border. I am a legal immigrant to Britain. I do think immigration can be a good thing in the right numbers if it's correctly calibrated to the needs of the country. I think that's great. But it doesn't mean that I support people coming into this country illegally and jumping the very queue that my wife and I went through in order to be here and to become citizens of this country. But anyone who raises that issue is immediately, again, dismissed as someone who has got the wrong concerns. I don't think there's anything prejudiced or wrong about wanting to have a country with borders. There's nothing wrong with that, but the way that it's presented is that there is, and so you're going to have this continued disconnect, I think, until the policies reflect the wishes of the public.
Absolutely, and I think as you talk about in your book, and I mean Douglas Murray has of course written about this strange death of Europe, and in successive books as well. Um, it is quite interesting, and this actually brings us to a broader topic, which is that we have such a hard time discussing hard topics if we
Hmm.
don't have a very sort of soft landing, nice answer to everything. We are incapable of actually having this conversation, and this also applies here in Iceland. It's just if you even speak about, let's say, for instance, immigration, and you don't have the correct view, you are immediately slammed as a racist and
Hmm.
xenophobe and all that, and you hate Islamophobia, all of these words that you know of. Why? Just to give us a why do you think that is? Why do you think that just because it is difficult conversation, we seem to have rendered ourselves incapable of actually having them?
Well, first of all, it's a tool. It's if you don't have an argument, it's very convenient to be able to call people names, and we live in a society in which suddenly it's become acceptable to do that. Um, in terms of the way that we communicate, I suspect social media has a big part in it. The way that we talk to each other, and I'm as much to blame as anyone for this. The way we talk to each other on social media bleeds through to the way we talk to each other everywhere else, including on our TV discussions and whatever. I also think that one of the perverse incentives that social media has created, unfortunately, is that um, And it's not just social media, it's the technological revolution more generally. Is people like you and I who are creating content online are threatening the mainstream media and have been for a long time. Their numbers are going down all the time. And so they need outrage, and they need a heated discussion and debate and disagreement and whatever, because they think that's the way to preserve their audience. It's the way to get attention. It's the way to get clicks. This guy said this and she said that, and look at the fighting that's happening as a result, and wow, millions of clicks. What I think they don't understand, and this is the point I made, I don't know if I'm sure you would have followed the Kathy Newman Jordan Peterson
Yeah,
incident, and I said at the
yeah.
time, yeah, sure, Channel 4, the TV channel that did this interview, is going to get its 20 million clicks and it's going to go around viral around the world. But what these people don't realize, it's not going around the world because people are going, oh, look at Channel 4, they've done such a great job, this is a great source of content that I'm going to click on and stick with for the future. Those people clicked on that video, and what they saw was how the mainstream media treat people who have any opinion that is in any way contrary, that they're unfair, that they're biased, that they're prejudiced, and they will never watch Channel 4 ever again. So they've eaten and destroyed their own industry from the inside by engaging in the sort of clickbait that they are using to try and save their organizations. And when we were on Joe Rogan's show, this is the point he kept coming back to over and over: is like, the people on the internet are the only ones having the long form conversations about these difficult and different issues, because they're the only ones that are interested in doing it. The mainstream media are interested in protecting their brand. They've become big institutions, as opposed to what they might have been initially, which is a way for people to get information out there. And of course, he was never that pure. They always had owners who had their own agenda and whatever. But I think what is happening is the power of the mainstream media is crumbling, and they're scrambling around for attention. And that's one of the reasons that we have these very fierce conversations about issues that actually I don't think are that difficult. I actually don't think you would get that much disagreement across the country about these issues if they were discussed in a sensible way. You'd probably find that 60 to 70% of the country are quite sensible people. They're not extremists in either direction. They neither want open borders nor want to stop all immigration happening immediately. They just want it to have a sensible discussion about the right way to approach it, because large waves of immigration, when they happen over a short period of time, do cause disruption to the local communities. They cause concern to people. These are perfectly natural things that happen in every country around the world, not just in Western countries. Most non-Western countries have far stricter immigration rules than Western countries do, even though they have less need of them because fewer people want to go there. Um, and I actually think if we were to look at it from a pragmatic and sensible position, you'd find there isn't actually a huge ideological battle to be fought. It's just we've been having all our conversations through social media, and the tactic of calling your opponent names works very well on there, and that is now bled out into everything else.
That's a very interesting point. I didn't anticipate talking specifically about the media, but it's quite interesting that you point out this. The appetite seems to be much more within the realm of, for instance, Joe Rogan. I have not met the person who says, "Well, I sat down and watched CNN for 3 hours straight." It's just it does not happen. But for instance, I think you guys were 4.5 hour on Joe Rogan's show. I
Yeah,
have never.
yeah.
I was like reading a whole book, but a very good conversation nonetheless. I urge people to check that out as well. Um,
Mm.
but also, Channel 4, yes, Kathy Newman, obviously, it was quite embarrassing for her, if we're being quite honest. But same thing happened to Vice, which I was a very fond, I was an admirer of everything that Vice was doing like 10 years ago. I don't
Hmm.
know when that shift happened, but they also interviewed Jordan Peterson, where he also embarrassed himself, the journalist. So I think, just to phrase this into a question, why do you think the media companies are not willing to accept the new appetite that people seem to be having, but rather want to try and push their own thing within the same sort of structure, and at the same time call these people names, trying to post some video of Joe Rogan from 12 years ago saying the N-word. Why do you think they are not willing to try and change and try and sort of change their own structure rather than doing what they're always doing?
Because change is hard, especially the older you get.
Yeah.
The older you get, the harder change becomes. Think about this. Imagine, Tóti, that you do what you do, and it's hugely successful, and you're the Icelandic Joe Rogan, and everybody loves you, and you're crushing it. You've got the big guns, as you just did there, right? Everything's going great, and then suddenly, as you get into your 50s, suddenly the numbers start to drop off, and you're not quite, like you're not quite leading the thing anymore, and there's other guys coming along and they're doing something else, and you don't quite watch it because you're busy and you've got kids and you've got a life and whatever, but you just know that your thing works, right? I mean, I do what I do and this is great. So what do you do? Well, most people in that situation, they will tinker at the edges and they will double down. So what has worked for us over the last 20 years? Well, before the internet came along, you remember the big shift between our childhood, or certainly my childhood in the early 80s and 90s, to the noughties, was the 24-hour news cycle. Remember this? You remember the shift? Before that,
Absolutely.
you'd get your 6 p.m. bulletin, you'd get your 10 p.m. news bulletin, you'd buy a newspaper. That was it. There was no social media. There was no round-the-clock news. You got your news in a 5-minute batch. The BBC picked out what you should care about. The Times or the Guardian or the Telegraph decided what you should care about. And that was it, right? And then these guys came along and went, oh, if we put lots of clickbaity type of stuff about how everything is crumbling and it's outrageous, and we run this 24/7, there's an endless news all the time, we're going to get a lot of attention. We're going to get clicks. So then the attention span goes down. People want everything immediate, right? Because everybody gets busier. There's more news to go around. You can't watch everything, so everything gets snappier. And before you know it, the average person is considered to have the attention span of a fly. Right? And then social media comes along, the YouTube comes along, the podcasts come along, and you're going, well, yeah, these guys are doing that, but we've had success doing this. We got to make it more clickbaity. We got to make it more engaging. We've got to do 25 hours a day of news or whatever. And you double down and you double down and you double down. So partly it's just a generational thing, man. It's just they don't know how to do it better. I don't think there's also an authenticity problem with the mainstream media as well. Like, people can watch your show or my show, or read my Substack or read my book, and they kind of know that whatever, they may like me, they may hate me, they may be completely indifferent to me, but they know that what I'm saying is what I believe. When you watch Joe Rogan, you know that the dude you see on the screen is, if you ever get to meet him, is exactly the dude that you meet in person. And that's true. And it's the same with me. It's the same with my co-host, Francis. It's the same, I'm sure, with you and with lots of other people, right? We are who we are. I'm not saying we discuss everything in exactly the same way, but what we are saying on camera is authentic, right? The mainstream media is, by very definition, by its very nature, not authentic. By its very nature, it's fake people in a fake studio having a fake conversation. And the moment the camera turns off, they all go, fucking hell, that was a bit, and they say things as they actually are. Do you see what I'm saying?
Yeah. The Nothing Burger and Van Jones.
Right. And so what you've got is essentially a situation where people are pretending to be one thing on camera, and they're not that thing in real life. And everybody knows this. Everybody knows this. So the problem the mainstream has is a problem of authenticity. And authenticity is difficult because when you're being authentic and you're being honest, you're saying things that a lot of people aren't going to like and aren't going to hear, because each and every person has opinions that, if they are expressed in public, will be considered problematic by somebody, right? And so that's why any podcaster you get and you clip up what they said over 12 years ago, you're going to get something because they're just being honest. And we don't want that in the mainstream. And that's why people don't watch it as much, because we want authenticity. Authenticity, I always say this, authenticity is the currency of the internet. And my favorite quote about this is, I'd like to think it's George Carlin, but I don't think it was George Carlin who said this. That the most important thing in show business is authenticity. Once you can fake that, you can do anything. Right.
That's a good
And
one.
that's kind of and that's the situation, is like you can't fake being authentic anymore, because the internet, the way things are on the internet, is like you can instantly tell who's just in it for the clicks, who's just in it for the money, who's just in it for the attention, and who are the people that are actually trying to have a real discussion about the real issues because they want to have a conversation, or because they are curious, or because they're open-minded, or because they want the world to be better somehow. And that is the separation that the mainstream will never be able to bridge. That gap they can never bridge.
That's a very interesting point. You brought up comedy. Now
Mm.
you are a comedian on top of everything else, and I think comedy plays an essential role with regards to the issues that we have discussed as far. Um, Now I think the British working class will be the last people to give in to the demands of the woke tyrannical forces. I think, given my experience with British workers, that is the last group that will give in to the demands. Do you think that, or is there a possibility that British banter will save free speech?
Mhm. I don't know. I think that um, the tradition is very strong, and I really like it. But at the same time, we are now in a position where people are being arrested for things that they say in private WhatsApp groups. So,
Yeah.
given that most of this banter now happens in WhatsApp groups, it's hard to know. I think that the way to save our ability to speak freely and to joke freely is going to be much more about influencing legislation, and going down that route, because that's where really the threats are coming from. If we have laws on the books that allow people to be arrested for things that they say in their WhatsApp group, it doesn't matter how bravely we say things in our WhatsApp groups. Eventually, a lot of people are going to find themselves arrested and prosecuted, and therefore scared of talking and joking and doing all that sort of thing. So I think what we need is legislative change, and also you need a cultural shift back towards the idea that jokes are jokes and words are just words, and they're not violence. And yes, sometimes people might be offended by something, but it's not the same as actual violence. And that cultural shift, I think, will be a generational one. I don't know how old you are, but I'd be very surprised if, you know, if the next generation, maybe my son's age, so he's 4 months now, I'd be very surprised if they end up being super progressive, particularly the boys. The girls, we're seeing the stats on this now. The kids who are like 17, 18 now, the boys are really not that woke. Girls, yes, they're quite woke. But then, the thing is, I also think that part of this progressive ideology is a consequence that we are lowering the age at which people are taken seriously quite significantly over time.
Yeah.
I think if we decided to take 20-year-olds seriously 50 years ago, we probably would have been quite woke as well. A lot of it is just like people who haven't got enough life experience, and so they can say things like, there's no difference between men and women, and you go like, try having a boy and a girl and then tell me that, or try living with a woman for a long time as a man and tell me that, or and all sorts of other stuff. It's just a lot of it is just young people sort of just spewing their inexperience onto the world, and we are the idiots who are going, oh really, okay, let's make a law about this. That's part of the problem as well. Is that's why I talked about cowardly government. A lot of institutions are just full of cowardly older people who don't want to be disliked by their kids' generation. That's what it is, right? They don't want to be like the stale, pale male, who runs a company. They've got some kid coming in going, we need more diversity in here or whatever. Or, you can't say this. And instead of going, I'm the boss, you're the employee. If you don't like it, find another job. They went, oh, okay, let's, and that's where I see a lot of this coming from, as well.
Yeah, yeah, that's quite an interesting thing. Speaking of, or like a slight
Have I
sidestep.
offended all your youthful listeners here,
Probably.
Tóti?
Well, I'm 31, and most of my listeners, I think, are a little bit older than I am, but maybe also younger. So maybe you have achieved offending someone. But a slight sidestep. Useful idiots. You speak about useful idiots in your book, both with respects to the Soviet Union and people nowadays. How would you describe the useful idiot, and why do you think they are such a threat?
Useful idiot is, I think, a term that Lenin used to describe people in the West who could be persuaded to go along with communist bullshit in the West, who could be convinced that they really were building real socialism in the Soviet Union, that communism was brilliant and equality for all, and that nobody was being put in camps and there were no gulags and everybody there was no starvation and no famine and no oppression or anything like that. And there were plenty of people, many of whom I reference in the book, including everyone's beloved Bernie Sanders, who took a vacation in the Soviet Union. Not just a vacation, he went on a honeymoon to what was essentially the equivalent of like a left-wing politician going on a honeymoon to North Korea in today's world. That's what he did, right? So these are people who turned up. They were shown a completely fake reality by KGB agents who drove them around. They would be taken to fake weddings where fake Soviet citizens would have a lavish banquet with friends and whatever, actually, as the majority of the country was very poor and unfree. And useful idiots are people who will go along with complete nonsense, either because their own idealistic worldview means that they are willing to go along with things like that and believe them because it makes them feel good, even though it's not true. Or people, even worse, who will go along with these things because it benefits them personally. And you see these people in the West right now with Putin's invasion of Ukraine. There is a small minority, thankfully, of people on both the far left and the far right. It's not the far left and the far right. They're fringes of the left and the right. They're not necessarily far right or left, but they're just fringes who will happily go along with the Russian narrative about the invasion of Ukraine because it suits them. It allows them to think that they're contrarians, that they're speaking some unspoken truth. And we saw a lot of that. The seeds for this being sown during the COVID period, where you certainly in the UK, I don't know what the situation was in Iceland, but there was a lot of misrepresentation from the mainstream media. There was a lot of what they call gaslighting, a lot of lying, and the same thing happened over Trump, and the same thing happened over Brexit. And we've already talked about populism, and people were being lied to over and over and over. And so some people now believe, well, look, whatever the mainstream media is saying, in our country, the opposite of this must be true. And they're willing to go along with anything because they've become useful idiots. They're useful to people who are using them. They're regurgitating Russian propaganda to their Western audience of other people who also want to feel like they are, they've got access to the secret truth that the evil mainstream doesn't want them to hear and to see. And while I share their concerns about the duplicity and deceitfulness and dishonesty of the mainstream, it does not mean that you now basically start churning out Putin's propaganda because you want to be contrarian. But some people will go along with that, and those are the useful idiots. And the useful idiots are always the ones that are sadly a significant portion of the tools and the resources that hostile actors will use against our society.
That's an interesting distinction where you're saying that the mainstream media ought to be taken seriously, although their structure is based on something that will probably inevitably collapse at some point. But
Tóti, sorry, I didn't actually say that the mainstream media should be taken seriously. What I said was the heuristic of the mainstream media are saying the sky is blue, therefore the sky must be green, is
Yeah, all
not a
right,
good
all right.
heuristic, right? So that's not to say that I think that if the mainstream media says the sky is green, which they regularly do, it does not mean the sky is green either, right?
Mm.
So I'm sorry to deliver this awful message to all our listeners and viewers. You have to think for yourself. Right? You cannot trust the mainstream media, and you cannot trust the opposite of what the mainstream media says either. You have to look at each issue on its merits and go, what do I know about this? What do people I trust know about this? Right? And you have to make up your mind on that basis instead of being reactive and going, the mainstream media I used to believe, and they lied to me, therefore I no longer believe anything they say. It's like I disagree with a lot of the stuff I see in the mainstream, and I think a lot of it is highly suspect and questionable. If the mainstream media reported that gravity is real, would I jump out of the window to test it? No, because I have a brain. Right? That's all. That's what I'm saying.
Well, to think for yourself and form your own opinions is a big ask nowadays. Um,
Mm.
quickly about
But
the
one that we
war.
should make, with the one we should
Absolutely,
make,
absolutely,
right?
absolutely. About the war, there is one variable that also might prove as a force against the woke culture, which is that now gas prices, especially in the UK, are rising. All things will and probably quite fast get harder for the average person, both like everywhere in the West. Do you think that might prove to be a variable or a force in this culture war? Do you think that people will sort of like as things get harder, gas prices go up,
Mm.
everything will get a lot more expensive. Things will it would be harder to acquire just normal uh, beverages and normal food. Do you think that might prove as a force where people just like, no, all right, fuck this. You are not gonna be telling me how to speak. I will not do your pronouns. I have to get going because I have to put food on the table, and it's really hard
Mm.
nowadays.
It's interesting. Francis and I had Francis Foster, my co-host on Triggernometry. Him and I had a big debate about this throughout COVID, because I said at the beginning, well, look, maybe the pandemic is going to end the culture war because people are suddenly going to realize that there's actually a real threat and blah blah blah. And I was right for about 3 months, and then we had in this country Dominic Cummings, and then in America they had George Floyd, and before you knew it, the culture war just got worse and worse. I don't think the solution to this problem is going to come through more difficulty, even though I do think uh, part of the reason we can afford to engage in these conversations is that we have very comfortable and prosperous lives, of course. I suspect it's just going to be generational, where my generation, and I think yours, would you be a millennial as well?
31. I don't know where I might. Yeah, I think I make the cut.
Yeah, I think you make the cut. So our generation, uh, basically those people in our generation uh, who evolve out of wokeness over time by having real life experiences that do actually transform you, like buying your own house, having kids. This is one of the reasons I talk about the housing crisis we have in the UK so much, because it's part of the reason that these issues are becoming relevant, because it's hard to expect people to be grounded in reality when they don't have their own place to live in, they can't start a family, they can't get pair up and have kids, etc. So it sort of means that they end up spending time not on looking after kids who force you to confront reality, but sort of living in the world of the mind, if you like. I think what will probably happen is just the next generation of kids is not going to be keen to follow in the footsteps of the previous generation. They're not going to want to be like their parents, because kids never do. I think it's probably going to be much more of a generational shift, and they will start to seek out um, comedy and other content that pushes back against the dogma of their existence, and questions those things. So I think that's probably the more likely route. I don't think the short term things getting more difficult is going to change a lot of people's opinions about the culture war.
Do you think the prosperity? I mean, Peter Sion, who also was on your show and wrote the book "The End of the World Is Just the Beginning." It's a fantastic read. He talks about, I think it was 2019, which was the greatest year in humankind, and it will never come back. Do you think the prosperity as a variable is the reason for wokeness? Do you think that we could allow ourselves to become woke because we had such a good time and we were sort of trying to find problems in a different ways?
Yes, but yes, but I do think without prosperity, it's difficult to do all of that. There is also a lot of other factors that play into it. But I do think without prosperity, you don't have it. If we were all living on $1 a day, we wouldn't be woke. No.
Hmm.
But it's not like you get prosperity and then everyone becomes woke necessarily, right? There are countries like Singapore, for example, that are richer in GDP per capita than most Western countries, Western European countries. I don't believe that there's a lot of wokeness in Singapore, from what I know. So it's not just about prosperity. You need a few other things in place before it starts, I think. But prosperity is a prerequisite for sure.
What are the other variables you think?
I think that you have to have a extensive breakdown of the family unit. This is very important. Enabled through technology and ideology at the same time. So you have to invent the pill, and then you have to use that invention to create ideologies that separate men from women, that break up the family, that suggest that um, the pursuit of economic outcomes trumps everything, and therefore you must drive as many women into the workforce as possible, even though the data is pretty clear. While it's desirable for women to have that option, essentially creating a society in which everyone is forced to work all the time, right? Couples have to both work all the time. It makes both men and women, but particularly women, really unhappy. Um, Being stuck in a cubicle for the entirety of their life is not the option that most women would choose if they had that option to choose. Um, it's So the breakdown of the family, I think, is essential. There's legislative changes that you can introduce to accelerate it, and then before you know it, we had a very interesting woman on our show called Mary Eberstad, who wrote a book called Primal Screams: How the Sexual Revolution Created Identity Politics. And this is one of the things she talked about: the angst that you see among a lot of the activists who are pushing these progressive ideas forward. Andy No, the American Vietnamese journalist who does a lot of he creates a lot of coverage on Antifa. He posts these mugshots of Antifa people being arrested. Like, you look at those people, they're not happy people, right?
No.
I don't believe that most of those people come from a stable two-parent household in which they were given the care and support and education that they need to feel like fully fledged human beings who are happy with their lives. A lot of this stuff comes as a result of deep resentment and unhappiness, I think, that can only be produced by having a really unpleasant childhood. And we know from all the data that uh, having a parent be absent, despite the heroic efforts of what are mostly single mums, we talk about single parents, they're heroic. I mean, I have a 4 month old boy who's next door with my wife at the moment, and how she would be able to look after him on her own is beyond me. Like,
Yeah.
and I have tremendous amount of respect for any woman who does that. But at the same time, we do know that the statistics are very clear. If you grow up in a single parent household, it's much more difficult for you to succeed. You're much more likely to go to prison, much more likely to die young, much more likely to be absent from school, much less likely to succeed in education, much less likely to succeed in your career, and so on. So, and that's because there are psychological traumas that come with the breakdown of the family, and I think that's probably one of the biggest contributing factors to all of this. Then you need social media. Then you need all sorts of other things as well, and you
The
package that
perfect
up
storm.
that you got the perfect storm, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, Thomas Sowell has talked about a lot about this with regards to the New Deal where in which he talks about that the incentive structures of that have been pushed through legislation have pushed this fatherless society, and all of the Western countries have followed suit. And I think, I mean, we have all of these statistics. You quote in the book Obama, who was talking about fatherlessness, and I have spoken to a lot of feminists, or not a lot. I've spoken to a few feminists who come on this show, and I've always wondered why this isn't a talking point within the realm of feminism, because they should really be giving the men a lot of shit for not getting a grip and doing what society demands of them and raise their children. They should not be able to just run away, and that is a very interesting factor.
It is, and I think you're starting to see that change. We had a very interesting woman who I was super impressed with, who is a feminist, called Louise Perry, on the show, and she talks about these very things, about how the sexual revolution has been terrible for women. Does not mean that she wants all the women back in the kitchen, but um she does make this point, and I think the reason that it hasn't happened is that a lot of the feminists uh, who we've been speaking with, certainly in the public space, they've all kind of come from a more liberal feminist perspective, which has been that, freedom for women, free women should be able to do anything, and women should be able to sleep with as many men as they want, and slut shaming is bad, and all of this, and that may all be very true. However, it turns out that if you liberate both men and women, women don't get the best deal. um, and some feminists are starting to realize this, and they're starting to realize that if you carry on making everybody quote unquote free, what you're actually doing is you're advantaging a very small minority of men to benefit from that, and you're disadvantaging almost everybody else. And women are the ones that suffer because, for both biological and cultural and psychological reasons, they are the ones that get the raw deal at the end of it all. So I think you're going to start to see some of that conversation change. And I hope we do, because there is no question that, look, it's a complicated issue. Not every man who is not present in the lives of his children is not present in the lives of his children because that's what he chose, right?
Yeah, yeah.
Sometimes it's the other way. But generally speaking, with that exception aside, um, biologically speaking, from an evolutionary perspective, that is an instinct, a male instinct that has to be regulated societally, because otherwise it makes perfect sense for a man to have kids with a woman and then leave,
And also,
biologically speaking.
and you give a correct analysis of the argument, but I think the depiction that it's freedom is just rationally wrong, because I mean, nobody's asking to for women to have less sex and to go back to the kitchen or stop working. The argument is more within, or from the perspective of the men should be pulling their weight. I am not asking anything different of women. I am saying that men should be pulling their weight with regards to raising the children, because that is something, as a society, we should incentivize people. And just needs to be a cultural shift, because I mean, it is a problem here in Iceland, and I know it's a problem in the UK, and it is a problem in the US, and we know from the statistics why that is. So I think that I'm not going to say it has nothing to do with women, because of course the women have to sort of do everything on their own, but we should be focusing on the men who should be pulling their weight.
Well, I agree with that, but I don't think it's quite as simple as that, because if you think about what the sexual revolution delivered, it delivered to men the thing that men always wanted deep down inside. Every man is the desire to have sex without commitment,
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
biologically speaking, right? And so if you have a variety of women who will give you that, then that's what men are going to do, because that's what we're biologically programmed to do. And that's why you have to have cultural institutions that restrain and control the instincts of both men and women, and say to them, actually, the best thing for you to do is to come together into a committed relationship, which is called marriage, right? But if you spend half a century running around talking about how marriage is oppressive and restrictive, which by the way it has been, right, you're going to have a tension there. And I'm not saying women were wrong to campaign against some of the oppressive patriarchal structures that definitely did exist to some extent. I'm just saying we as a society going forward have to work out that pursuit of freedom from the family unit, if you like, right? Where does that end, and where do we go? Okay, we've got enough freedom now. Now what we need to do is to work together for the betterment of ourselves and our children. And that is the tension that I see playing out. So just going, men are bad, men need to look after their kids. I agree with that. Men need to look after their kids. And I'm trying my best. And believe me, it's not that easy, but I'm doing my best, right? But on the other hand, you also have to have women on the other end of that who want to come together and form that unit and show flexibility on that front as well. Because the truth is, some of the so-called difficulties between men and women are not ever resolvable because of biology. Someone has to carry the child, someone has to breastfeed the child. Men and women are built differently, and they evolved to do different roles in a family unit. And that's not to say all men should do this and all women should do that, but across the board, on average, the woman is much more likely to spend more time with the kids. The man is much more likely to be out there bringing home the bacon. It does not mean I want everyone to be doing that along their sexual lines, but that is a family environment that works best for children, and both men and women have to sacrifice something for that to work, right? Men have to sacrifice their desire to have sex without having consequences, the desire to have sex with more than one woman or whatever after a certain point, and women are restrained by family. They are. My wife is not able to pursue the career that she otherwise would have been able to pursue because we have a child, right? And that is a choice that she makes. And it's restraining, just like the choice to earn a living for both or for all three of us while she looks after our child is restraining on me. I could be out there driving a Ferrari and having sex with models, at least in my imagination, right? But I am also restrained. So both of us, both parties, for things to work, have to have a willingness to work together, right? Otherwise, we're never going to get anywhere. So that's kind of what I think a lot of feminists are starting to realize, which is why I talked about the freedom aspect of it. There is a part of this, of making this work, that requires both men and women to self-restrain a little bit. And we hate it in modern society. We hate someone telling us we got to restrain ourselves.
Yeah. That's a very fine point to end on. I had so many more questions. I absolutely love this conversation. I'm gonna finish this. Well, before I do, just tell our listeners where they can find you. And you're on Twitter. What is your
I'm on
Twitter
all the
tag?
social media at Konstantin Kisin. The stuff I would really love your audience to check out is I write a Substack in which I talk about these issues, the stuff that's going on in Ukraine, because it's something I have quite a lot of knowledge about through connections and being from both Russia and Ukraine and so on. I talk about the cultural stuff a lot, and I try to put some really interesting content out on my Substack, and of course Triggernometry YouTube show and podcast. Just look it up on the internet, on YouTube, wherever you listen to your podcasts.
Lovely. Now, final question. And I am going to steal a feature of your show. And my last question, because you guys always end on asking your guests this: what is it that Konstantin thinks we should be talking about, but we are not?
What are we grateful for? What do we have to thank our lucky stars for? We never talk about it. And almost every spiritual tradition that is designed to make your life better involves some element of giving thanks for what you have. It is that will make your own life better. Looking around and going, what am I grateful for? What am I thankful for? What am I privileged to have? Truly privileged to have, not in this white privilege and male privilege or whatever, but actual privilege that we all have. And Francis always says the true privilege that no one's talking about is first world privilege. We all have it in the West. We all enjoy it. Look around and notice the things that you're grateful to have. That's what we're not talking about enough. We always talk about the problems that we have, and they're many, and there will be problems till the day we die, and we can talk about them endlessly. What are we grateful for? What should we be thankful for? What are we not appreciating as much as we could be?
That's very interesting because I think Jordan Peterson talked about this a lot as well. He was when he was in conversations with feminists. He I think he just said it bluntly. Just why are you so ungrateful? And I thought to myself like, wow, that is a bit rude. But
Mm.
in all honesty, I think this is very interesting. I think it's something that we ought to be. We should be grateful for everything that we have, especially in the West, because the West is an anomaly, both historically and globally. So yeah, I could definitely agree with that point. But Konstantin, this has been fantastic. I absolutely love having you on. Thank you so much for accepting my invite, and I will probably contact you probably later on.
Anytime, man. Anytime. I really enjoyed this. Great questions. I hope your audience enjoys it, and I look forward to seeing how it goes. Thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great one.